Jewish Online Magazine, it's the Jewish paper review, and our special guest today is Jonathan Goldblum, Northwest London, and amongst his honours he has degrees in Middle Eastern Studies. Good morning.
Good morning.
And thank you for joining Jewish Online Magazine.
Yeah.
I understand we're going to be taking an article from the Jewish press.
First,
yeah.
The first one, I don't know if people have read it, and this has to be very brief, but it's concerning Avram Stern, who was the leader of the Stern Gang, as it was called in Britain. It was called the Freedom Fighters of Israel, Lechei Cherut Yisrael, in Israel, Palestine. And this is from the Jewish press, and the article tells you how an elderly lady, she's now an elderly lady, when she was young, she in Israel, in Tel Aviv, she was looking after Avram Stern when he was engaged in these activities against Britain. But I think it's important to understand that the background to all this, and the background of this was that the British came to her house and they killed him because whether they were correct to kill him in the way they did.
What period is this?
This is in 1942.
Okay.
In the middle of the First World War, because he was, according to a policeman there, he was killed, although he didn't resist. The British said he was killed while resisting. But the point is, this came after the beginning of the First World War, and during that period the Stern Gang, or Lechei, decided to attack the British. And this is a very controversial thing, which is very difficult for most of us to understand, because Britain, mostly and rationally even, was fighting, to understand emotionally and rationally, because the British were fighting against the Nazis and he was fighting against the British in order to have a Jewish family. This was due to bitterness on the part of he and some of his followers. They were so bitter against the British for not allowing Jews to come to Palestine, Eretz Israel as it was then, that he even fought against them. So you need to, when looking at this, you need to see the attitude in this country is very anti-Stern. The attitude in the United States is much more positive, partly because it was anti-British, but you have to see the whole thing in the background. And reading this article, this lady was looking after Stern, etc. They tell you what happened, and it's very dramatic and so on and so forth, but one needs to study much further. There's a book by Professor Yossi Heller, who was a friend of mine, which is rather critical of the Stern movement. The others are much more in favour. You should distinguish between them and the Irgun, which was the Irgun Tzvai Leumi, the national military movement, which was called by the English the Irgun, was called by the Israeli the Etzel, who would not fight against Britain during the war, hoping that they would reverse their policies of not allowing.
Was there a relationship between?
Yeah, the Irgun, yes, they were I think they effectively, the Stern group broke away from the Etzel before the war. The followers of they were the followers of Jabotinsky, who himself was even less militant than the Etzel were before the war. And after the war, they engaged in activities against the British, but of course, as did this Stern movement, and also even the Haganah at times. So that's a whole complicated period. So that needs to be studied. I think this article should be read, should be basis for a study of the period before, during and after the war, which is an enormous study. The other thing I would like to talk about, which is also concerning the Second World War, okay, is that the article by Bernard Wasserstein in the Jewish Chronicle last week, and also the review of it. This is a book. He's a professor of modern history, Jewish history in Chicago, about the Jews of Europe before the Second World War, and this it tells you in great graphic detail. It's well written, it's intelligent. It tells you many quotes about how bad things were. For example, that the great historian of before the Dubnov, who was a great Jewish historian beforehand, and very much revered, said this is the end of Jewish civilization, etc. So all kinds of things were put in here about the situation of the Jews before the war. But the review in the Jewish Chronicle tells us, and again people ought to read this book, that this was that he was describing this as the decline of Jewry before the war was very far gone, very developed very much. Because of the economic conditions, the poor conditions, the cultural problems, the fights between the religious and non-religious and so on and so forth. And the reviewer in the Jewish Chronicle, which one should read, also says many people will be shocked by this analysis. But I feel that in looking at this analysis, one should compare the situation of the Jews at that time and also before the war.
What's your analysis on this?
I say before the war, I mean before the First World War. Because these situations, you're talking about assimilation. Well, you had that assimilation you had very much in Central Europe in the 18th century, time of Mendelssohn. You had, Agnon has written, the great writer, Nobel writer, has written after the First War, Oreach Notel Alun, an essay, a book in fact, describing how Jewry had declined as a result of the First World War. The First World War had, people here don't realise, had many pogroms and many bad events. People expected bad things. My late father-in-law, who was a refugee, fled from Czechoslovakia into Poland and was pushed into a large building with a lot of other Jewish refugees and spent a terrible night there. Said that the Polish Jews said, "We are doomed," and the Polish Jews came the next morning with fruits. The same Jews who said that they would be doomed, despite the great poverty, they came with lots of fruits and to help them, which showed the great moral quality. Now he's describing all sorts of unfortunate events and terrible things happening and so on and so forth, partly as if it was partly Jewish attitudes and partly not Jewish attitudes. The question is, what is this something basically new? And how does it compare to the Jews before the First World War in these respects? How does it compare to Jews in other countries? Well, these phenomena didn't exist in this country. From what I can see, this was a pretty low period in Britain between the wars. The Jewish life was declining very much. People were leaving the religion, people were becoming acculturated. The attitude to Judaism was pretty negative. And to Jewish scholars, even among some of the so-called Orthodox people. And why is this any different to the situation? Of course, people were better off financially. Because they were better off financially, does that make them morally superior to people who lived in Europe? What about the Jews of America? And the writer here says that the Jews, the United States and Britain and so on, took on some people. But as my late father said, and it is clear that the British took proportionally far more people than the Americans did, which was a much bigger state. The Americans complain about Zionism. The Americans were much more negative to Zionism than the British, because they never gave would have given let the Jews in, etc. It's much more complex. Now, we talk about American Jewry before the war. What about, he was a professor in Chicago, what about the life in Chicago and all the gangsters? And what about the decline of Jewish life in the United States? The decline of Jewish observance was something horrendous, and life was extremely difficult financially. Why, in what way was this different to the, of course there was much more grinding poverty in Poland, but does that make the people any worse? Or is there any less reason why they should live or continue to live? So I think these are this, and I was told today by an historian of Jewish matters that in his book Wasserstein, he wrote a book about the Jews in Britain before the war. He never mentioned the efforts of Rabbi Dr. Solomon Schonfeld to save Jews, which was a very heroic thing. So, and of great significance. And therefore, we have to see, with all the information in this book, is it balanced? Is it fair? Does it look at the position of the Jews as they would have seen it from then? Does it mean that their life would never have gone? I mean, if Hitler had conquered Britain, could we not have said the same thing about here? I think there's a certain degree of, if I don't mind me saying so, of a kind of aloofness, of Anglo and also American aloofness to what happened on the continent. I think that Britain has not come to terms with the fact, and perhaps the United States as well, the fact that they never really rescued anyone, and they're trying to say that, well, this people were doomed, it was going to happen more or less anyway, is a very dangerous thing because of the hashlachot, because of the consequences of this kind of reasoning. And I think that it's about time Orthodox people took more interest in this sphere of things, because this is left to historians who are not particularly sympathetic to the traditional Jewish way of doing things, and there's a kind of cold, although there's a kind of cold approach, although it's warm in some respects, but the ultimate analysis is rather aloof and lacking in empathy, I would think, to some extent. Now, this may not be fair totally, because I haven't read the whole book, but one has to be careful with all these things as to what extent a person doesn't have preconceived ideas. Many historians have a certain theme, and they want to show something as if it's new, whether it is new or not. They want to have a certain theme, and they consciously or subconsciously present the facts in ways that fit their way of argument. So it's not only true of politicians. I can give you details of historians who have behaved in this way and have changed their views according to their, my view, personal interests as to their career and so on and so forth, and to whether they needed support, whether they needed to make a splash with their doctorates, and afterwards whether they didn't need to make a splash with their doctorates, with their opinions. So we have to take all this pinch of salt, but it's that since most or a large proportion of the people who were killed in the Holocaust were observant Jews, I think observant Jews should take a more active, try to be fair, not too partisan, but concerned interest in all these kind of discussions, and whether it's written in the Jewish Chronicle, or it's written in the Jewish press, or it's written in the Jewish Tribune, or the Hamodia, is not the point. The point is that things that need to be read. Whether people should buy these things or not, that's a moral judgment, and I'm not saying that they should by any means. But people who claim to be intelligent should examine these things and put their weight behind their honest views and opinions. And I hope this has been of slight use to you, but I feel you should definitely read the article by Bernard Wasserstein, which is called the JC Essay. I'm not clear if it was part of his book or not, but whatever. That article, and also the book review in the same paper, which says will arouse people's concerns, and I'm sure that there is some room for concern. Whether that is just, whether this is all correct or not, cannot be finally said till one reads the book. One has to have some guidelines into how to approach these things.
Okay, thank you ever so much, Jonathan, for your paper review, the Jewish Press and the Jewish Chronicle, and all being well, this might be a regular feature. Thank you for joining Jewish Online Magazine. Thank you.